Over to West Asia now, the US is worried that Syria may be developing new types of chemical weapons. This follows a recent statement by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who accused Russia of failing to enforce the chemical weapons ban.
First, I want to mention that we are watching very carefully, and the United States is extremely concerned about yet another report of the use of chlorine gas by the Syrian regime to terrorize innocent civilians in East Ghouta, Syria, outside of Damascus. If confirmed, the attack is the third reported instance in the past 30 days in East Ghouta. We take the allegations of chemical weapons use very seriously and are working with our partners on the ground to investigate the reports. We will continue to seek accountability through all available diplomatic mechanisms, including the United Nations Security Council and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, for the confirmed use of chemical weapons by any party. We call on the international community to hold the perpetrators of these attacks accountable and will speak with a united voice in condemnation. If we fail to uphold the principles set forth in the many international agreements related to chemical weapons, we undermine their fundamental principles and we fail the innocent they were created to protect.
The U.S. also said that President Trump is prepared to order military action against the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad's forces if necessary in order to deter the use of chemical weapons. Washington reiterated that the stance taken by the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson when he said that Russia, which is Assad's ally in Syria's multi-sided civil war, bears responsibility for failing to enforce the chemical weapons ban. Russia has denied any complicity, and the Syrian government has said that it hasn't carried out any of these attacks. WION's West Asia correspondent Daniele Pagani joining me live from Amman. Good evening, Daniele. Thanks for being with us on the broadcast. First of all, how can we be certain of the fact that Syria owns and operates these chemical weapons?
Well, the answer is pretty simple, and it is we cannot. The problem is that the lack of independent observers on the ground makes it very difficult, and the chemical weapons being one of the, I would say, major elements of the propaganda on every side on during the Syrian war. But there is an increasing amount of evidence which are linking directly the remains of missiles found on the ground where chemical attacks happened and the Syrian government stockpiles, or at least what was held before 2014 in the Syrian government stockpiles. So this is the first problem we have. We have remains of missiles, and these missiles have been proven to be at least linked directly chemically to the Syrian government warehouses. Now, Syria has denied all these allegations. They say they destroyed all their chemical weapons in 2013-2014 after an agreement brokered by the United Nations. We cannot rule out the possibility of some anti-Assad rebel groups, for instance, what was known as Jabhat al-Nusra, which, to put it simple, is Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, did actually steal an enormous amount of chemical weapons in 2012, so we cannot rule out that they are using these weapons against other rebel groups. Certainly, the problem is that as long as there is no independent observer on the ground who can carry out independent tests, independent investigations, it's very difficult, and all this is subject and vulnerable to conflicting narratives and propaganda.
Absolutely. You said Syria has vehemently denied that it has carried out any such chemical attacks. It's been backed up wholeheartedly by its ally Russia. But tell me, Daniele, Russia has been blocking that investigation at the United Nations into the Idlib attack repeatedly. Does that sort of underscore doubts furthermore that Syria actually was complicit, as was Russia?
Definitely, yes, rightfully so. You remembered that Russia vetoed several times a new investigation led by the current investigating teams on the chemical attacks, and the finding of these current teams are pretty solid. A few days back, for the first time, we had results, test laboratory results, telling us that there is a direct link between what happened in 2017 in Khan Sheikhoun, where hundreds of people died due to a chemical attack. There are direct chemical links between those weapons and the weapons that Syria had. Russia is obviously vehemently denying. Why so? Russia is I would say, staunchest ally together with Iran of President Bashar al-Assad. So Russia has all the interest in not being embarrassed by the fact that Assad army is actually using these chemical weapons. Again, this is a fact of competing narrative. The US are holding Russia responsible for the chemical weapons. Russia is saying that the US narrative is flaunted because the US wanted to portray, to throw a bad light on President Bashar al-Assad. So yes, I mean, these high-profile propaganda, competing propagandas, is even further making things more complicated and making it impossible for international observers to truly understand where are these chemical weapons, who's using them, what channels are they following, because if these are being used and the government is using it, or any other group, this needs to be investigated and punished by the international law. Remember that the use of a certain amount of chemical gases is banned by the Geneva Convention.
All right. One very quick question, Daniele. It's interesting that we're talking about this, this relationship between Syria and Russia, because when we look at Afrin, I know this is tangential, but when we're looking at Afrin and the number of players who are involved as far as the Turkish offensive goes and the reactions we've seen come in from different partners, do you find that some of those alliances and relationships actually run contrary when it comes to the Afrin debacle?
Look, the problem here is the whole problem is that Syria is not a country anymore, and every single warring party is pursuing its own agenda. So Russia is not helping President Bashar al-Assad out of charity. They are helping him because they want to regain a prominent role in West Asia. They're helping them because they know that there will be space for Russian companies during the reconstruction, and also the United States are playing their role. So the Turkish offensive is currently targeting an armed group which is strongly allied with the United States of America, which could be the US proxy inside Syria for the future. Therefore, Russia doesn't have too many problems in Turkey attacking this. Beside, Turkey is a good ally for Russia in this moment. In fact, Turkey and the United States are fighting against each other diplomatically, obviously, inside the NATO, and it's all the interest of Russia to weaken the NATO. So Russia is very conveniently looking from the balcony what is happening and what is happening into Afrin, because that will weaken the United States position and will strengthen their ties with Turkey, which they very much need of.